Hello and welcome to another Dungeons & Dragons session dramatization set in the world of Alter Aeon. Our protagonists are Kara the Warmage, Morden the Hexblade, Tess the Sorceress, and Sienna the Rogue. I am Shadowfax, the Dungeon Master.
Session 14, Mining for Kobolds.
Prior to this session, we had a short, haphazard mini-session on Easter where two things were accomplished. First, I ruled that based on her behavior up until this point, Tessa's alignment had changed from chaotic good to neutral good. Second, in the last session, the players had received a Ring of 4 Wishes. Kara made her wish, and the Ring of 4 Wishes became the Ring of 3 Wishes. She wished for a pair of fully functional wings. I ruled that such a request fell under the Greater Effects clause of the wish spell, and had my wife roll a Knowledge Arcana check to see if her character could properly execute the wish, and she passed. She rolled a die to see how fast she could go, and now Kara has a pair of brown-laced scarlet-colored feather wings, with a cruising speed of 60 feet per round. I told her that it was a good thing that Blaze's +1 black leather armor of sexiness was backless, or else she probably would have seriously injured herself. Our story begins with our heroes standing around on the road north of Pelham in the middle of the night, trying to decide what to do with the wagons they have retrieved from Cadenissimo. Sined suggested that Master Highgander could use a mount spell to have the wagons pulled, but there still would be no way to safely cross the Twee River and get them to Vemarken without a functional bridge. The group decided that it would be safe to leave the wagons where they were for the night and headed into town. Sined went back to the fort, and the party slept in Maria's hut. In the morning, our heroes grabbed some breakfast and spoke with Pilkum. He agreed to go out and use his magic to have the wagons pulled to the fort. He also wrote up for them an official writ declaring that the Chain Devil had been taken into custody of the Church of Denton. With that, the party was off and headed east toward Vemarken. It was a bright and sunny day, and nothing bothered them during their journey. At the river, they met a crew that was hauling blocks of stone to the location. They told our heroes that a cleric from Dragontooth would be arriving in several days to help construct the bridge. For the time being, our heroes crossed the damaged bridge, holding on to one of the rails, and proceeded to Vemarken, arriving in the early afternoon. Rodnar was busy working, but as soon as he saw the party, he passed his project over to one of his apprentices so he could talk to them. They related to him what had happened with the Chain Devil, although they left out the part about taking him to the Keeper of the Reliquary. Instead, they presented to him the writ that Pilkum had provided, and told him that the wagons were at Fort Margera. Rodnar did admit that it was highly unorthodox, but if the group assured him that the bandit would no longer be a threat, he believed them, and would arrange to have the wagons brought back when the bridge to Pelham was finished. Rodnar said that he didn't have the reward for completing the contract with him, but asked if Boris could stop by the bank later and bring it to them, and Morden agreed. The party stayed with Rodnar for quite a while and chatted with him and each other about a number of topics, ranging from blacksmithing to Kara's new wings to local cuisine. Sienna showed the gems that he had collected from the sirens and expressed interest in making jewelry with them. Rodnar said that he'd be happy to rent the equipment he needed. Sienna didn't have enough money, so Morden covered the cost. Kara, Morden, and Tess then left for the town square. Kara went up to the Mages Guild and returned her book to the Guildmaster, Lotus, while Morden and Tess headed to the general store to buy some mangoes. When they were crossing the town square, Morden and Tess heard somebody singing and playing a mandriola. A half-elf in colorful clothing stood in front of the Sheep and Shovel, and he was singing a song about them, referring to them as the heroes of Pelham. Intrigued, Morden and Tess approached him. The minstrel recognized them on sight and seemed delighted to speak with them, eagerly asking about their latest exploit in pursuing the mysterious chained bandit. Like they had done with Rodnar, they shared how they had tracked and met Cadenissimo and their encounters with the pirates and sirens, but did not mention anything about the Keeper or the Pelham Reliquary. The bard flirted a little with Tess, much to the chagrin of Morden. The minstrel then asked if their priest friend had remained in Pelham, and they answered that he had. It was at this point that the encounter took a turn in a decidedly different direction. The minstrel, who never revealed his name, had of course stopped singing in order to talk with our heroes, but throughout the conversation he had continued to softly play his instrument. He then addressed the sorceress again, stating that he was also half green elf, and, without prompting from Tess, inquired how much of the Mossiglo family fortune was still intact. Tess was immediately taken aback, since she had gone by her stage name of Tessiera Topaz and had never revealed her actual surname to anyone since leaving Ralnoth. The minstrel must have noted her discomfort and sensed that he had overreached, because the tune on his mandriola suddenly changed. Tess was completely enamored with the new melody, and eager to hear more of the song. Morden briefly felt a supernatural tugging at his psyche, inviting him to lose himself in the rhythm of the song. But Morden's will was steeled against such enchantments, and he resisted the urge. Noting Tess's sudden and total fascination with the minstrel's performance, Morden realized that something was amiss. He looked down into the minstrel's face, and willed a hex upon the half-elf. Typically, when Morden hexed someone, he would receive a brief bout of emotion that would confirm the success of his curse. However, he felt no such sensation, and knew that his attempt to hex had failed. His target gazed back at Morden, and by the glint in his eyes, Morden suspected that the minstrel understood what had just transpired. Turning to Tess, the minstrel casually suggested that she put some coins in the purse hanging from his instrument's pickguard, and she immediately did so. Morden told Tess that the minstrel was trying to hustle her and suggested they leave, but Tess said that she wanted to stay. The hexblade put a hand on her arm, but she pulled it away and retorted that he was just being jealous, while the minstrel looked on and smiled. Before the bard could react, Morden then reached out and grabbed a hold of the mandriola's neck, pressing the strings down so that he couldn't effectively play. The minstrel tried to pull the instrument back, but Morden tightened his hold. The bard continued to ineffectually struggle against Morden's grip, while the hexblade explained to Tess that he was using some kind of magic and had just swindled her. Once he was sure that Tess was free from the enchantment, he let go of the mandriola. Morden then demanded to know what the bard was up to, and he replied that he knew she was rich and could afford to spare him a few coins. The bard made a quick knock on the window behind him. Morden commanded the bard to return the gold, and, with a smile, he obligingly opened the pouch on his mandriola and let the coins fall to the ground. Morden scooped up the money and gave it to Tess. After both of them chewed him out, they left for the general store. Kara had finished up in the Mages Guild and caught up with them at this point. Glancing back at the tavern, Kara saw a pair of dark elves dressed in garb similar to the minstrel come out to join him. The three of them chatted with the storekeeper and bought some fruit and tools. After relating what had just happened with the bard to Kara, they decided to go back to the tavern and warn the bartender about him. Upon exiting the general store, they saw that the bard and his compatriots were gone. They went into the tavern anyway, and the bartender informed them that they were trouble and he had thrown them out. Kara, Morden, and Tess spent the rest of the day relaxing in the guild hall. Once Sienna was finished with his jewelry, he joined them for dinner. Boris stopped by after dinner to deliver the 600 gold pieces promised to them by their contract. He took a moment to compliment Kara on her new wings, and after that the barrister spoke with Sienna, although he decided to forego any attempt at speaking Draconic this time. He said that he had been checking over the town's records since their last conversation and hadn't found any paperwork regarding his arrival in Vemarken. He then politely asked Sienna if he could tell him how he got to Slowey. Sienna replied that he didn't know. He believed that he had arrived by ship, but Boris replied that was quite impossible, stating that contemporary sailing vessels could not sail far enough to reach the island, and that the portal in Vemarken was the only way on and off of Slowy. With encouragement from the others, Sienna then recounted how he had been lost in the wilderness of central Atmir, and while foraging for food, he had found some sugar pellets that put him to sleep. Next thing he knew, he woke up in a cage, and was fed more food that also put him to sleep. He eventually found himself in a mine with other kobolds. He was given a pittance by his overseers, but he often lost his meager earnings to the other older kobolds who bullied him. Sienna managed to escape the mine during one of the many rebellions. He had no idea where he was until meeting his new friends. Boris was quite disturbed by all this. If what Sienna said was true, somebody was smuggling kobolds onto the island and forcing them into servitude against their will. Sienna simply wasn't familiar enough with the island to tell him where the mine was, but Boris had an idea. With Sienna's permission, he cast a detect thoughts spell, and had Sienna try to remember where he had been since leaving the mine. Sienna did his best, starting with Pelham and recalling backwards from that point where he had traveled. He crossed a river using a broken bridge. There was forest, then marshes, more forest, and more marshes, and then finally a lake near the mine's entrance. Boris recognized the lake immediately, declaring it to be Lago de la Muerte. Morden explained to his companions that it was a body of water in the northern Blue Marshes, about 3 hours' travel southeast of Vemarken. The road to a new farming community being built on the east coast ran near the lake. The party asked Boris what he was going to do about what he had just learned. The barrister carefully thought about it for a moment, and replied that he would need time to digest the information. But at first glance he guessed that the town council lacked the resources to investigate the matter properly. He asked Sienna if he remembered what they were mining for, and the rogue replied that was basically anything shiny. There was a lot of quartz, but what they found most of all was a brittle, dark gray ore. After describing it, they figured that it was the ore of a rare metal like adamantite, and that they were likely exporting it off of Slowy. He said that he would consult with Guard Captain Sovel in the morning and see if anything could be done to more closely inspect containers going through the portal and intercept any contraband. But that was probably all they could do for now. Although slavery was illegal, it sounded like the workers were technically being paid, albeit an absurdly low wage. Furthermore, the mine lay well outside of Vemarken's area of legal jurisdiction. He then left. Sienna asked what they were going to do. Kara and Tess immediately told Morden that they wanted to help, and he agreed. He said that they would sleep on it and decide on a plan the following day. The next morning, when Morden woke up, his canine companion appeared next to him, as it did every morning since he had summoned it. His dark companion, however, wasn't as dark as usual, and instead looked more gray, and its image was distorted and fuzzy. The others asked him about it, but he wasn't sure what was going on. Sienna went down to the town square to sell the jewelry he had made the day before while the others discussed strategy. It didn't take him long to find buyers, and after that the four of them left town via the east gate. Not far from Vemarken, the terrain became softer and wetter. Many trees grew in the marsh, which became more numerous the deeper into the marsh the group went. The road was made of packed earth, raised above the surface of the water a few feet in most places, but only a couple of inches above the water in some spots. After about 3 hours, the party skirted the northern shore of Lago de la Muerte. They moved cautiously, looking for any sign of danger. In the northeast corner of the lake, the road turned away from the water to head east, but our heroes discovered a small footpath that ran parallel to the eastern shore of the lake. The trees were thick in this part of the marsh, forming a canopy overhead much like in the forest of central Slowy. Enough trees had been cleared away for a narrow footpath. After hiking down the trail for about an hour, the party found a small hill of bare dirt. Sienna said it was where the dirt that had been removed from the mine was piled up. Kara took to the sky to take a good look around. When she was about 100 feet up, she was spotted, and the party was attacked. Kara was buffeted by a flaming sphere and a trio of invisible force projectiles, while a fighter clad in full plate armor emerged from the forest and charged Morden, striking him with the full force of her greatsword. Tess turned to face Morden's foe, but was held in place with a curse, feeling like a layer of impenetrable stone covering every square inch of her body. Sienna slipped into the trees in search of one of the enemy casters, and located a bare-chested orc with a battle-axe casting a spell on himself. He sneakily circled around behind him and prepared a sneak attack. Morden tried to hex his opponent, but it didn't work. It wasn't that the enemy resisted his hex, he just didn't seem to be able to do it. Nevertheless, Morden fought back against his opponent, landing a well-placed blow on the fighter's side between two plates of her armor. Kara scanned the swamp but couldn't see anyone but the fighter, so she tried an offensive spell with a wide area of effect targeted where she thought the flaming sphere had come from. The Ice Storm spell conjured a sheet of hailstones that flattened a large section of the trees. Amongst the broken trees, one of their opponents was revealed, a hobgoblin wearing a red robe. Tess was frozen in place, but not helpless. With careful aim, she cast a shout spell, trying to catch the enemy in the edge of the spell's effect without harming Morden. The fighter was unprepared for such an assault, and the sonic energy severely battered and bruised her. Nearby, Sienna struck the orc from behind and hid in the trees, avoiding having the orc spot him. The enemy orc then advanced on Morden, joining the fighter on beating him down. Their combined attacks laid Morden low, and his magic companion vanished, all before Tess's eyes. Tears involuntarily streamed down her face, and her neurons burned as she struggled against the curse that held her in place. She shouted another magic attack out of sheer frustration, and her opponents, although better prepared for such an attack, were still wounded by the fringes of the shockwave of sound she emitted. They tried to leap out of the way, but the enemy fighter took the full force of the spell and was knocked out. The orc took a moment to quaff a potion, and many of his visible bruises instantly mended themselves. Meanwhile, the hobgoblin assaulted Kara with smoking green projectiles, the telltale sign of a Melf's acid arrow spell, which fortunately did less damage to her than they could have had she not been wearing her magic armor. Kara responded with a blast of flame spell, engulfing the enemy wizard with a cone of red-orange fire and scorching all of the floor around him to cinders. The severity of his burns caused the hobgoblin, with his formerly red robe, now blackened with ashes, to stumble, but he managed to remain standing. Having also seen Morden go down, Sienna advanced to chase away the remaining nearby opponent. Fortunately for the Kobold, the enemy cleric had already been severely wounded. Sienna engaged with hit-and-run tactics, striking the orc and retreating into the woods before he could retaliate. The orc was worn down by attrition and soon brought down. Sienna yelled to Tess, asking how he could help her, but she replied that there was nothing that he could do. It was then that he spotted the remaining foe that had stayed hidden until this time, a gnome in a chain shirt, facing upward in the middle of casting a spell, about 40 feet away. With singular purpose, he made a beeline toward the newly available foe. The enemy wizard blasted Kara with another flaming sphere, but she finished off the hobgoblin with a bluish-white orb of acid. However, as soon as she had completed casting the spell, she felt a wave of numbness wash over her. Despite her best efforts to resist the curse, her muscles seized up, her wings froze in place, and she ignominiously fell to the ground. The impact knocked her out. Sienna saw Kara fall from the sky, but couldn't tell where she had landed through the nearby tree limbs. He resolved to check on her as soon as he had dealt with the foe before him. The gnome had spotted Sienna and began to jog backward. He retrieved a crossbow and fired a bolt at the oncoming kobold. The bolt loudly clinked off his armor without harming Sienna as he closed to melee with the gnome. The gnome threw his crossbow at Sienna and drew his sword, and the two dueled. As the kobold and gnome crossed blades, the two seemed well matched. at least at first. Sienna, however, was the superior swordsman. After a prolonged exchange of blows, he got the upper hand and slew the gnome. He then went looking for Kara. Sienna found Kara's unconscious body lying amongst the scorched remains of the trees she had burnt down. He held a digit under her nose and determined that she was still breathing. Sienna started digging through her backpack and found her wand of Cure Light Wounds. Now, Sienna had had some rudimentary training about how to use magic items when he was younger, but he wasn't confident in his skills and was afraid of doing further harm to Kara, so he kept looking. He then found a healing potion and carefully dribbled its contents into Kara's mouth. Once Kara was awake, she used her wands to heal her and Sienna, and the two of them got up to look for Morden and Tess. Back at the path, the spell binding Tess finally expired, and the sorceress rushed over to Morden. She sat him up and saw that he wasn't breathing. She began to despair, then suddenly remembered something. She fished the Ring of Wishes out of his backpack, put it on her finger, and wished for Morden to return to life. Another gem vanished from the ring, and Morden's body began to glow with a bright light. His wounds closed themselves before her eyes, and he took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was a smiling, red-headed half-elf maiden. They kissed. Morden tried to stand, but the resurrection sickness hadn't worn off yet, so he got dizzy, and sat down while Tess filled him in on what had happened. Kara and Sienna arrived at this point, finding the couple sitting on the ground in each other's embrace. Kara said that she was glad Morden was all right, but Tess told her that he had died, and she had brought him back to life with her wish. The war mage asked Morden what it was like, and if he remembered anything. He thought about it a moment, and responded that he had vague memories of his parents, siblings, and other family who had perished at Dunhurst. He asked how long he had been dead, and Tess told him it had been less than 10 minutes. Morden was surprised to hear this, stating that it felt like it had been much longer. The last thing he remembered was the face of a humanoid with delicate feminine features, bright pink skin, and long blonde hair with her eyes closed. He supposed it to be some sort of omen. Morden was able to stand by then, so the four of them searched the corpses of their enemies and stashed most of the loot in the hollow of a tree. They then proceeded onward, discovering a depression with footprints leading in and out of it. There were some crates and barrels stacked up around the depression, and in its center there was a number of stone slabs arranged in a circle, like a large water well with a pulley system, but it actually turned out to be an elevator. When the party got close, they could hear someone shouting up from below, demanding that someone lower the elevator and let him up. Morden obliged and let the large, basket-shaped platform down. He then cranked it back up, and a very surprised gnome suddenly found himself surrounded by armed opponents. He immediately surrendered. Sienna was up in the gnome's grill, waving his sword dangerously close to the prisoner's neck. The others calmed Sienna down, and the group had the prisoner drop his weapons and exit the basket. After a brief interrogation, the party learned that a magic alarm system had been set up, with different sounds and patterns to indicate different conditions and responses. Kara ordered the gnome to sound the alarm for the taskmasters to evacuate the mine, and they began to hear a throaty klaxon sound off from below. Soon another voice called up from the mine, and Morden let the elevator down and hauled up 4 more gnomes. Like the other, they carried weapons but were unprepared for a confrontation. After being intimidated by Kara, they surrendered. Morden let the elevator down again, and they caught 4 more taskmasters, 3 gnomes and a halfling. They were separated from their weapons and held with the others. One last haul caught 2 more gnomes, who also surrendered without a fight. With 11 prisoners in their custody, the party began to grow concerned that they would try to escape. So they used their Scroll of Force cage and trapped them inside a prison of pure force, barely large enough to contain them. They decided to have Kara fly back to Vemarken to see if they could get any help dealing with the situation. The party continued to question the taskmasters. Apparently, their leader, named Krull, was the hobgoblin wizard they had slain. Sometime after Sienna had escaped, Krull had given up any pretense of paying the kobold miners and began treating them as disposable slaves. News of this infuriated Sienna, who suggested in earnest that they kill them all and be done with it. Mordred and Tess replied that it was probably more important to get the slaves out of the mine first. Agreeing that they would be more likely to trust Sienna, Mordred lowered him into the mine to fetch the kobolds while the interrogation continued. The prisoners said that all of the ore and gems they mined were taken away by Krull's boss, who was an especially tall kobold that they had only ever seen once, and they did not know his name. They said that there were 20 kobolds in the mine. When asked about a supply chain or slavery ring, they said that there hadn't been any new slaves for months, and that Krull had told them not to expect any more, threatening to enslave the overseers themselves if they did not make the slaves work hard enough. Once in the mine, Sienna easily navigated the tunnel by memory and arrived at the central communal cell where all the miners currently were being held. The barred door on the entrance was locked, so Sienna started picking at the lock. Hearing him fiddling with the lock, the trapped kobolds approached the door to see who it was and were relieved to see another kobold through the bars, hopeful of impending liberation. One of the kobolds helped Sienna by trying to pick the door's lock from the other side, and, working together, they were able to get it open. All of the kobolds, including Sienna, made their way out of the mine, with Mordred operating the elevator to get them all out. Once the kobolds were out, they took a head count, and there were 20 kobolds. They had carried out with them 7 speckled eggs. Usually, kobold eggs weren't speckled, but upon seeing them in the light, Sienna remembered that he had been told that his egg was covered with copper speckles, and he wondered if they were dragonrot like him. The other kobolds explained that a tall, charismatic male kobold had arrived a couple of months earlier and had mated with all of the females. The speckles were a dark reddish-brown color. Sienna had no idea what that meant. One of the former slaves then piped up and asked if they should do anything about their dead companions. Asking about the matter, Sienna learned that some kobolds had been sent deeper into the mine and had died, but no one knew why. Mordred asked if his people had any special burial customs, and Sienna answered that they did not. Yet he was curious to see what had happened. The rogue decided to investigate and asked if anyone would show him the way, and one said that she would. Her name was Beryl. She had been acting as the group's ad hoc all-watcher, trying to look after the others as best as she could. The two went back into the mine, through the human-sized main tunnel, into the smaller, kobold-sized tunnels, until reaching a vertical drop. A pulley with a rope had been set up, so Sienna tied the rope around himself in a makeshift harness, and had Beryl lower him down. The hole was through the ceiling of a cylindrical chamber made of a flat gray stone, about 20 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter. There was some writing on the wall that Sienna couldn't read, and a shut pair of stone doors leading eastward. The chamber stank of death. At least 10 dead kobolds were in there. Many of the bodies had been bisected or dismembered. Once Sienna had made it to the floor, he started toward the nearest dead body. A blade shot up from the floor, but Sienna deftly avoided it. It retracted back into the floor. Turning around, he decided to approach the door instead, and another blade trap was sprung, which he also avoided. Sauntering up to the doors, he jumped up and grabbed one of the handles and pulled with all of his strength, but the door didn't budge. He called for Beryl to pull him back up, and the two of them exited the mine. Sienna related to his companions what he had encountered. The other kobolds were getting very anxious and were about to flee. Tess tried to convince them to come with the party, and they would try to find them jobs or help them return to their old tribes. Sienna translated when necessary. Tess even offered them some money to help them on their way. The kobolds decided that while they were grateful for being rescued and would happily take the coins, they didn't trust them enough to go to Vemarken. Beryl asked Sienna if he would go with them, but he declined, stating that he was learning a lot from his new friends and wanted to stay with them. The former slaves then took their former overseer's weapons and departed into the wilderness. Back in Vemarken, Kara was informed that Boris was still at work, so she stepped through the portal to Indira. The watchman on the other side immediately recognized her and gave her directions to Boris's office. She related what had happened to Boris, and the barrister plied her with questions. At first, he was afraid that Kara and her friends had ambushed some poor hedge wizard who was just defending himself, but Kara cleared up any misunderstanding. The barrister sighed and said that he guessed that he had no choice but to get involved now, and had his assistant put his golden armor and tabard on him. He knocked on the back door of his office, and 5 more apprentices wearing similar tabards, red with gold crosses, and armed with swords and shields, joined him. 4 hours had passed by the time Kara had returned with Boris and company. Morden and Tess passed the time gazing lovingly into each other's eyes, while Sienna taunted the captives. After getting an update from Morden and Tess, Boris began questioning the prisoners, who pleaded for their release, accusing the party of murdering their employer and imprisoning them without cause. They said they were running a legitimate operation, and further insinuated that their captors had been abusing them. Boris looked at the pile of gnomes plus 1 halfling stuck in the force cage, and then back to Kara, Morden, Tess, and Sienna. Turning back to the prisoners, he then stated that he didn't believe them, and that if the heroes of Pelham had detained them, it must have been for a good reason. Boris then unleashed the full array of paladin magic he had at his disposal, casting Detect Evil, Zone of Truth, and Detect Thoughts to get to the heart of the matter. The prisoners withered under his interrogation. Morden turned to Kara and Tess and asked if they had known that he was a paladin. They had not. He then remarked that it was almost scary to think what a lawyer could do with paladin powers. Boris learned everything that the party had and more, obtaining the name and place of birth of each of the captives. Once he was satisfied with the information he had gathered, he considered what to do next. Sienna said that they should all be executed, and while Boris shared his anti-slavery sentiment, he also said that a lawful execution would require a trial, and murder charges would be difficult to prove under the current circumstances. He said that the best he could do was exile them. He would take the slavers into custody, shove them through the portal in Vemarken, and command that they never return. Sienna was somewhat reluctant, but ultimately the party agreed. Tess dismissed the force cage, and Boris and his apprentices led the prisoners away. Upon passing by the dead fighter, Boris took a good look at her, and told the party that she was the mayor's missing maid, and was confused as to what she was doing out there. Boris then wished the party good luck exploring the mine. By then it was getting dark, and the party considered their options. They thought about heading back to town, but they did find some mundane mining supplies in the nearby barrels and crates. They could also bring the loot they had collected back and buy some more magic items.
And that is where our session ended. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel to continue following the story of our heroes. Transcripts of our Dungeons & Dragons sessions are available at www.lawful-evil.org/DND. If you enjoyed this and don't already play the game this is based on, you can explore the world of Alter Aeon for yourself by visiting www.alteraeon.com. Remember, the family that plays together stays together. Thanks for listening, and happy mudding, everybody.
Alteraeon.com. That's ALTERAEON.com.